Hi, in today's video we're going to take a look at switching your nixos system and home manager to using flakes, which will allow you to pin dependencies and improve reproducibility of the nixos installation. So what I'm going to do is switch across to my notes here. So the first thing that you need to do is edit your nixos configuration file, which is in etc nixos configuration.nix. And what you need to do is add the following to enable flakes: nix.settings.experimental-features equals nix command flakes. After you've done that, you need to rebuild the system with either sudo or doas and nixos rebuild switch. After you've done that, you'll have flakes enabled, and what you can then do is actually create a directory where you're going to store the flake and the hardware configuration and configuration.nix files. So typically the hardware configuration and configuration files are stored in etc nixos, but what we're going to be doing is creating a directory in our home to store them. So in this example, I'm creating a directory in my home folder called git/nixos-root. If you're using something else, you'll need to change the commands as you go along. So what we're going to do first of all is create that directory. Then you change into the directory and copy the nix files into it with cp etc nixos *nix dot. So what that will do is that will copy the configuration.nix and hardware configuration.nix into that directory. Okay, so what we need to do next is actually create the flake.nix file. So this is the flake.nix file that I'm using for my nixos system configuration. So what we have here is the description, and the next section is the inputs. So we have nixpkgs.url, and I'm actually using unstable. If you want to use another branch, you need to change that to nixos 2505. And then in this section here, what we have is the outputs. And what you need to do if you want to use this is actually change this one line here where it says Pollux, which is my system name. So what you need to do is look in your configuration.nix and system name. I'm sure I've got it set somewhere in here. Oh yeah, it's the networking.host name. So what you need to do is take the networking host name from your configuration.nix and add it in here. So that's basically the gist of the nix file, and what you'll see here is we're just importing the configuration.nix, because if you have a look at your configuration.nix, it will actually import the hardware configuration.nix file. So you only need to import the configuration.nix file, and that will actually import the hardware configuration file. Okay, so there's some issues that you're going to actually run into with permissions and Git. So what happens is we have a let me close this out a second. So what you can see here are the file permissions for the Git repository that I have created, and you'll see that they're owned by my user and users. Now the issue is to actually run the nixos rebuild switch with the flake option, you need to run it with either sudo or doas. So what you actually need to do is set what's called a safe directory. So what's going to happen is if you run doas or sudo with the nixos rebuild switch flake option, in that directory you will actually get an error. So what you need to do is run doas git config --system --add safe directory, and then the path to the Git repository. So in my example, it's home git nixos root. The other issue you may run into is you may get an error about the tarball cache directory as well. Let me just grab some tea. So even though the tarball cache directory isn't a Git repository, it's actually used to rebuild the system. So if you get an error about that, what you need to do is run a similar command, which is doas git config --system add safe directory home cache nix tarball cache, and that will resolve those git errors you might run into. So the next step is you'll actually get an error on the nix cache directory permissions. So what you need to do is actually change the ownership of the nix cache directory so that it matches yours, because what happens is when you run the commands as sudo or doas, will actually change the permissions of the cache directory to be owned by root. So what you do is you run doas chown -R for recursive users home cache nix, and that will resolve the nix cache directory permissions error. Right, next step is actually rebuilding NixOS using the flake. So what you can see here is in the new directory that we have created, what we're going to do is run doas nixos rebuild switch --flake. And you can see here where it's in single quotes, which is needed for things like the ZSH shell, because of the pound here, the hash. What you need to do is replace Pollux with the name of your system, basically. So again, remember, check in the configuration.nix and have a look at your networking host name, and that should match the host name that you set in the flake.nix file as well here. We run doas nixos rebuild switch --flake and the name of your system in the Git directory that we've created. What's going to happen after that is you're going to get a message saying the Git repo is dirty. What you need to do is actually correct the ownership of the flake.lock file. What's going to happen is the first time you run this, it's actually going to be owned by root, and you need to change that using chown by running doas chown users flake.lock, and that will fix the ownership error that you might run into. After we've done that, what you can do is actually commit the file. So you run git add flake.lock, git commit -m flake.lock, and then git push GitHub master, and that will push up the changes. Now, when you want to upgrade the system, what you need to do in the directory with the new files that you've got, you can see here, we've got the configuration.nix, hardware configuration.nix, the flake.nix, and the flake.lock. What you do is you run nix flake update. What that does is that pulls down latest changes. What you may then actually run into is another error that I came across. You may get an error saying cannot create empty blob in the object database. So if I just come into .git objects. So what you'll see here is run that again. So in the Git repository that we've created, if you run ls-al.git objects, you will see all of these files listed here. What may happen is you may get one of them. One happened to me was one of the E versions was actually owned by root and root. And what that was doing is it was stopping the update. So what you need to do to fix that is run doas chown dash capital R users.git. That will then fix that permission error. You then run nix-flake update again. And then once you've updated the flake, you run doas nixos rebuild switch dash dash flake and then your host name here. Once you've done that, you can add the file. So git add dot git commit dash m nixos-flake git push GitHub master. Now, sometimes what happens is you may get an error with some package not working, which prevents the upgrade. So if you actually get an error with the system not being able to upgrade because of an error in some package, what you can do is actually reset the lock file from your Git repository on GitHub. So what you do is you run git checkout in single quotes head and then caret here dash flake.lock, and what that will do is it will reset the flake.lock file to the previous commit. You can also go back to other versions like head 2 for 2 commits ago, and you can check the log for the flake.log by running git log dash one line flake.lock. Once you actually reset the flake.log file, you'll need to rebuild the system again by running doas nixos rebuild switch dash flake and your host name, and that will set the system back to the previous version that worked properly. Okay, so once you've done that and you've rebooted, you've got everything working, you can actually remove the channel. So you can run doas nix channel dash remove nixos, and then you can actually remove the nix files. You may want to actually back these up first of all, just in case you need to revert or you don't want to use flakes or whatever. So if you want to remove the nix files that are no longer needed in the etc nixos directory, you can run doas rm-i etc nixos configuration.nix. You'll be prompted to remove the file and then do the same thing for the hardware configuration.nix. You can then actually delete the old generations from your previous channel install of nixos by running doas nix-collect-garbage-d, and then you can run doas nix-store -optimize as well to remove the hard links that will still be hanging around. Once you've done that, what you can also do is delete the older generations. So what will happen is each time you rebuild the system, you get a new generation listed in the boot menu. What you can do is you can actually delete those older generations that were using the channel setup as opposed to the new flake setup. And you do that by running doas nix-env -profile nix-var nix profile system -delete generations old. Now, the next time you actually rebuild the system, what will happen is it will have removed all of those older generations that were still listed in your boot manager. So we'll now take a look at switching your home manager to using flakes. I'm actually using home manager as a standalone install and not as a module. If you have a different setup, then you're going to need to figure that out yourself. So first of all, what we have is the flake. And what we need to do is add this to the top level of our Git repository. So over here, what I have is my Git repository for all my dot files. And what you'll see here is if I turn on show hidden files, you'll see that I have my shell config, .config, git, and various other directories. And what you need to do is actually add the flake.nix file to this directory. And what you will see here is if I come into my config, I also have my home manager in my dot files here. So you can see I've got my home manager and various other configs. I also have the home manager installed in config home manager. So this is important because what we're going to be doing, I come back here in this flake.nix file, is referencing the home manager files in the git repository and not actually installed in config home manager. Okay, I think you need them in both places basically, but let me go through the flake.nix file. So first of all, we've got the description here of the flake. Let me just make sure I'm actually on the, yeah, okay. Right, so we have the description here, home manager configuration for username on system. And then we have the inputs. And this is actually using NixOS unstable. If you want to use a different version, then you would need to change that to, like, I think it's NixOS-2505 or something. And what we have here is home manager itself. So we have the URL for the home manager, an input nixpkgs follow nixpkgs. So this section basically is actually going to install home manager, I believe. And then what we have is the outputs. So in the outputs, what we need to do is actually define our username. So this is the username on the system. So you need to change this to your username on the system. What you'll see down here in this section, home configuration, is it's actually referencing that username variable. So username at Pollux. So you'll need to change Pollux to the host name on the system, as I described earlier in setting up the NixOS flake for the system. So those are the two things that you're actually going to need to change in this setup. And what we're doing here is referencing the system up here. So this is x86-64 Linux. Okay. And what you'll see here, this is the important bit. .config home manager home.nix, and what this is actually referencing is the .config home manager home.nix file here. And if I open this up here, you'll see that this is actually importing another couple of files. But like with the nixos-system-flake, you don't directly import those. You just import the home.nix here, and it will actually import all those other files as well. So that's the basics of the flake. So just to recap the things that you might want to change, the branch that you're using needs to change the host name here, and this Pollux here, you need to change that to your host name. So change your username and your host name. Okay, so once you've done that, what you can actually do is add that flake to your Git repository. So git add dot and then git commit -m and whatever message you want to put for the commit message. So once you've done that, you'll actually have everything set up to go. So what you need to do is actually make sure you're in the Git repository that you've created, and then you can run home manager switch -- flake, and this is the part that you need to change. You need to change the username and the host name here, okay? And those should match the settings in the flake that we created. So remember to run the flake option with the correct username and host name, otherwise you're going to get errors. So once you've done that, you can actually I think you then run nix-flake update, and you then can add the lock file and the flake.lock file. So git add flake.lock, git commit -m, the commit message, and then git push to GitHub. Now, when you want to update the system, the home manager setup rather, what you do is you run nix-flake update. You'll get an error saying git repo is dirty, and that is because it's created a new flake.lock file. Now, again, you may get this error that I mentioned about the NixOS system. Fatal cannot create an empty blob in the object database. You get that error, what you need to do is actually have a look in the, let's come back into git nixos-files -x.files .git objects. So have a look in the git objects directory and see if you've got anything owned by root and root as opposed to your user -users. And what you'll need to do is run does chown -R user users.git, and that will fix the permissions error. If you get that error, what you then need to do is actually run nix-flake update again, and this time it will succeed, and you won't get the error about not being able to create an empty blob in the object database. So that's how you do the update, and then you finally run home manager switch --flake single quote dot hash username at hostname. Once you've done that, you add the new flake and push the git repo. So you run git add dot git commit -m flake updated git push GitHub master. And again, if there are any errors when you're doing the update, so suppose you run nix-flake update and you get an error with some package not being able to build. I'm actually getting an error on this system at the moment with DaVinci Resolve not being able to update because the SHA sum is incorrect. So what you can actually do, as I said, you can revert the flake.lock file. So if for whatever reason you get an error with something not being able to build because of some bug, which you can check out on NixOS PKG GitHub, what you'll see on that page in the issues, you'll see a list of issues related to the Nix packages, and you can raise an issue if you're having any problems. But what you basically do, as I said, you run git checkout head caret --flake.lock. That will revert the flake.lock to the previous version. And what you would then do is you'd run home manager switch --flake username at system again, and that will rebuild home manager to the previous working configuration. Okay, so what you can now do is, after you've done that, you can actually remove the home manager channel. So if you run nix-channel -list, you'll see home manager listed. And what you can do is you can run nix-channel -remove home manager, because it's been installed using the flake and it's no longer needed, because we're switching from using channels to flakes. So as I showed you in the previous section about the nixos-system-flake, once you've switched to flakes, you can move the channel. So that's how you remove the Nix channel for the home manager. And then what you can actually do is run garbage collection. So if you run nix-env -list generations, what you'll see here is I just have 2 generations listed, okay? Because I deleted the generations that were created before I switched to using flakes. But the way you delete generations, there's 2 ways you can do this. You can run nix-env --delete -generations old, and this keeps the current configuration but removes all the other generations before it. If you want to keep the current generation and the 5 previous generations, what you would do is run nix-env --delete -generations +6. So that keeps the current generation and the previous 5 generations. And that's just a way to clean up the garbage for Home Manager. And then finally, what you can do is run garbage collection on the Nix store. So you can run nix-store -gc, and that will basically remove all the old Home Manager installs that we're using channels, as opposed to your new system that we're using flakes. So I'll switch across back here to my Home Manager config. So what we've got here basically is the flake.nix, you can see here, and the flake.lock file. Now the other thing I should mention is what I do is I actually have a Nix directory in my home folder where I store Nix shell and Nix develop files. So what I have here is, which I covered in a previous video, is index.tts. I have a shell.nix file here. I've got Kokoro, and I have Whisper and WhisperX. And I've set Whisper and WhisperX to actually use a flake.nix file and a flake.lock file instead of a shell.nix file. And what this allows me to do is actually run Nix develop instead of Nix shell. And the difference between the two is they both create a environment with all the packages you need to run something, but the Nix devel using a flake is actually pinned. So when you actually run Nix shell with a shell.nix file, what can happen is it can just update. So you go to use the Nix shell and it will actually start downloading stuff and installing stuff again, which is really irritating if you want to actually get on and do some work. So I've actually got Whisper and WhisperX set up using flake.nix files, so that when I run Nix develop, what happens is it will just set up the environment and I can use it, and it won't be updated unless I specifically run Nix flake update. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is because you can store multiple Nix flake and Nix lock files in your home directory, and they won't interfere with the Nix flake and Nix lock files used for Home Manager to install all the applications, because we're basically running the we'll come back to the command. The Home Manager switch --flake is run in the root directory here, so it's only going to actually use this flake.nix file, not any of the other ones stored down here, which would obviously mess things up. So that's basically how you switch both the system and Home Manager to using flakes. As I said in this example, I have a standalone install of NixOS Home Manager as opposed to a module. So what you'll need to do is, if you've got it installed as a module, you'd have to create a different flake.nix file for that, and you'd have to do some research on that. So what I'll do is I'll put all the links to these Git repositories and the notes here for setting up the Home Manager Flake and the System Manager Flake. So let's just have a quick recap. So again, this was the System Flake here. So first of all, you need to set up flakes. You copy the stuff across. You set up the flake, and we had to go through and actually fix various permissions with this. So what I would actually advise if possible, which is what I did, is I have my main machine, which is a Dell XPS 15 from 2019, and I have an old MacBook Air from 2011. Both are running NixOS, and what I did was I actually did the switch on the MacBook Air first of all, before I did it on the Dell XPS, and that basically helped me resolve a lot of the issues before I did it on my main production machine. You might not have that advantage of having another old machine at hand, but hopefully some of these issues that I run into about the various permission errors that you might get will help you make the switch cleanly. So there are, a couple of things that you need to do. It's not too bad. The actual setup of actually switching from channels to flakes, but there were a few issues that had me stumped for a while, and I had to figure out. So again, this is the system setup for switching to flakes, and this was my home manager setup. So what I'll do is I'll just actually show you the repository. So again, this is the home manager repository, and this is the system repository. So in the system repository, what you'll see is I've got 4 files. I've got the configuration.nix and the hardware configuration.nix. So the only thing you need to change in your configuration.nix is actually flakes. Is adding this line, nix setting experimental features, nix command flakes. You don't need to change anything else. You then just need to create the flake.lock flake.nix file, and for the system, you need to make sure to use the correct URL for nix PKGs. In this case, I'm using unstable, and the only thing you need to change in this file here is Pollux, which is the networking host name for this system. So that's the only thing you need to change in there. And as I said, you only need to import the configuration.nix, because the configuration.nix will actually import the hardware configuration.nix. So that's the only thing you need to set up on the system side. And if we have a look at the flake.lock file, what you'll see here, I just updated this today. You can see there's not actually a lot in here. It's quite simple. The other thing I should mention is I'm using Emacs, and there is a Emacs package for Nix mode. So if you're using Emacs, I'd recommend installing the nix-mode package, which will give you syntax highlighting for Nix files. And on the home manager side, again, what you need to do is create the flake.nix file in the top level of your Git repository. And remember, in my setup, what I have here is I have the .config directory, home manager, and my home.nix file, and the imported files here as well. And the Nix file, the flake.nix file, is actually referencing those at the bottom. So you can see here modules, .config, home manager, home.nix. So we're actually referencing the home.nix file in the Git repository, and not in .config home manager in your home directory. What I do is I actually tangle, that is write out all the files. So in my emacs.org file, managing my .files, what I have here like Home Manager, I have all the files listed, and what I do is I actually tangle those, that is, write them out to both the Git repository and the home directory as well. So I think you need to have them in both places. Doesn't hurt, they're only little text files, but that's just something I wanted to mention, that might have you stumped, that you need to actually reference the home.nix file in the Git repository, as opposed to, as I said, in your home directory. So hopefully that gets you started, or pushes you in the right direction to actually switch to using flakes. Got some advantages in that you can pin everything, and if there's any issues, you can just roll back by reverting the lock file and either rebuilding the system or rebuilding Home Manager. So I'll put links to all this under the video and hope that helps out.